Oh, good. Will, could you put your thumbs up if you can hear us?
Really bad.
Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for a lab meeting on Friday afternoon. My name's Neil Jacobs. I am the head of the Open Research Programme at the UK Reproducibility Network. I'm going to be saying a little bit about some of those things and a little bit about some other things that we're doing as part of the UK Reproducibility Network. Who here knows about the Reproducibility Network? I'll ask people in the room, actually, rather than people on. Right, so I'm going to skip very quickly over that part of the presentation then, and move on to some of the things that you might not be so familiar with. A little bit of background. This is going to be stuff that you're all super familiar with. The reasons why we have a reproducibility network, we have a reproducibility problems, and the sorts of things we might do to improve them. But arguably, there's evidence that it's not yet getting better. At least it's not getting better as fast as we would like it to get better. This is results from a 2021 survey showing a range of questionable research practices. And some fairly high figures there of people confessing to them. This is from a Dutch survey reported in 2022. Again, fairly high figures for a range of questionable research practices, including lack of transparency in important sorts of ways. You can see some of those listed on the left-hand side of the slide there. So failure to report important details in publications, not submitting negative studies for publications, not talking about study flaws, selective referencing, those sorts of things. So that's all still going on. So that's sort of our rationale for the reproducibility network. But I wanted to throw this slide in here, just slightly left field, because a lot of the questionable research practices that we've just been talking about are relevant to particular kinds of research. Often empirical research of particular sorts of scale. So we've been having conversations with people in arts practice research about concepts that psychologists are very familiar with, such as reproducibility and so on. And those words don't mean the same thing, if they mean anything at all, to people in theatre studies, drama, and so on. So there's work to be done, I think, and I'll say a little bit more about that on how we have conversations across disciplines about some of the terms that we might use, some of the concepts we might use when we're talking about the quality and the rigor of research. So this is the UK Reproducibility Network. You'll all be familiar with this. It's one of a number of national reproducibility networks. Now we've got between 15 and 20, mainly in Europe, but also in Canada, Australia, Brazil, and other places. So that's growing quite rapidly now, and it's and the sorts of things that the Reproducibility Network does. One of the new things that it's been doing, and I'm grateful to Jackie here for this, is resources such as some animations to help either you or the people that you'd like to introduce these topics to understand sort of why open science is a good thing.
Research these days is increasingly digital. Many disciplines are moving from more manual practices or point-and-click software to methods and analyses that involve writing or adapting code. Researchers might write or use code at many points in their workflow to run experiments, simulations, or models, to clean or analyze their data, or to present their findings in graphs, figures, and paints. But when sharing their research, many researchers often leave the code out, as they may not know how to share it, or they may not think their code is worth sharing. Instead, researchers are used to simply describing the analyses, models, or processes they used the code for, or presenting only the outputs it created. But actually, sharing the code itself is the most accurate and complete way to show how the research was actually done. It preserves all the small details. That makes code an integral part of research. Code that is made freely available to others is called open code or open source software. The authors will assign it an open source license so others can legally reuse it, and it should include documentation and metadata to help others use it properly, such as how to install it or comments in the code to explain how it works. However, it doesn't have to be perfect. First step is simply to share. There are a lot of benefits to sharing code. When others want to read and understand your research, or maybe even replicate or build off it, it is much easier for both them and you when all the code underlying it is openly available, ideally in one place. Others can see exactly what the code does or doesn't do. They can fix any problems and improve functionality by going straight to the source. And they can build upon your research without having to recreate it from scratch. This gives your work more impact. Open code also makes the transition much smoother if you or your collaborators leave a project and want to hand it over to someone else. Funders are increasingly seeing the value of sharing code and software, which means they are increasingly rewarding or even sometimes requiring it. There is a huge community of sharing code and software online, including tools, networks, and support. It can be a big benefit as a researcher to access this. Often, researchers don't have formal education in programming, so might worry that their code is too messy or inelegant to share. But many others are in this same boat. Sharing messy code is better than sharing none, and you can take small steps to learn how to write cleaner, more reproducible code. Preparing code for sharing does take time, but it also improves the readability and findability of your code, which your future self may appreciate. So don't hesitate. You can start small, and it's okay to make errors. Code is an integral part of research output, and it's important to share. To learn more, check out our UKRN primer on open code and software.
So the idea is that UKRN has a range of materials. So we've got, as it says, a primer, a video, an animation, a video, and some training materials on topics such as open code, open data, pre-registration, and so on. So those can be useful in various sorts of ways. Now, can I get back to my presentation? But you will have known all those sorts of things already. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the context that this is all happening in now, which, for example, the REF is one of the things that we're all paying attention to. There's been some initial decisions announced by the REF team recently, which make some of the work that we're doing quite relevant, I think, in lots of ways. Changes to the ways in which research excellence is defined, to emphasize collaboration and the ways in the process the research is done and the environment in which it's done. There's increased focus on research culture, open research robustness, and a much wider range of contributions to research are going to be recognised from different kinds of staff at institutions. So this includes research software engineers, data stewards, and so on. So there's some quite radical changes proposed here in the way that the REF is going to work, and that will be reflected, I'm sure, in the way that Bristol and other institutions respond to that. So I'm just going to talk now about some of the things that the UK Reproducibility Network is currently doing, finishing with a bit of a question for you, because I'd like you to do some work, if that's okay. I hope that's okay. So I'm going to talk about open research, quality control, cross-disciplinary perspectives, and research culture. So those sorts of headings about what UKRN is up to. So open research, again, this won't be unfamiliar to you, but that graphic might be. That comes from UNESCO, Open Science Recommendation released last year, and that is a legal instrument that the UK government, along with 180 other governments, have signed up to, committing us as a country and as a community to implement open research. And the UK government will be asked to report every 4 years on its progress in implementing this recommendation. And it's interesting to see the scope of that. Well, it talks about open research. We are familiar with perhaps open scientific knowledge. We may be sort of familiar with open engagement of societal actors through the ways in which we conduct participatory research, for example, but open science infrastructures in some ways, and open dialogue with other knowledge systems, and that's in particular thinking about indigenous and sort of lay knowledge systems, if you like, are all part of what UNESCO thinks of as being open science. And so that is quite a broad canvas on which on which we should be working. So UKRN, one of the things we've been doing is working with UNESCO on a guide to help universities implement this wide set of recommendations, and that will be released at the UNESCO General Assembly in November. We have the Open Research Programme that I lead, that I mentioned before, which is doing training, reforming recruitment, promotion and appraisal of staff, sharing institutional practice, and doing some meta-research, developing some methodologies about how we monitor progress on that. And we're also looking at the ways in which institutions, so like Bristol, support open research and open data in particular. So the ways in which, for example, there is training, there is resources, there are repositories available to you as researchers to implement open research data. There's a set of commitments that Bristol, along with other institutions, have signed, the Open Research Data Concordat. And it's not clear to me necessarily that institutions have found it easy to implement all of the things they should have done. So we will investigate that over the course of the next year. We think about quality control, and this is a group of universities that have been thinking about whether or not and how they might take a greater role in looking at the quality of the research that's produced within their boundaries, as it were. And there's all sorts of questions about this. You could imagine it being statistical checks, for example, pre or post submission for publication. You can imagine it being voluntary or even mandatory, and you can ask questions about who might do those sorts of checks and what the implications might be if those checks led to certain sorts of findings. So all of that is up for grabs, to be honest. And I'd be kind of interested in your thoughts on what might work there, what you think an appropriate role for a university might be, or a department. But the idea here is that we are taking lessons from particular industries. The automobile industry is one that Marcus quotes quite a lot in terms of the ways in which quality is managed upstream rather than checks being done at the end. Talk a little bit about cross-disciplinary perspectives, and I mentioned this earlier. The ways in which some of the concepts with which we're quite familiar are completely unfamiliar or mean very, very different things in different disciplines. So we are convening a workshop in November, co-organised by the British Psychological Society and a group called the Practice Research Advisory Group. And these are a group of researchers in music, drama, theatre studies, and so on, to talk about some topics: reproducibility, transparency, originality, and so on. And this is something that both Research England and the UK Committee on Research Integrity is really, really interested in as much as it speaks to notions of rigour, but it also helps us work towards a more common understanding of these important kinds of concepts that will help with multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. So as a result of that, we will produce inevitably a report, but we hope that that will be the basis for further sorts of conversations between different combinations of disciplines and research fields over the course of the next year. The other thing that we're doing is we've had funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council to recruit what's called a story associate. So they've got a program called Story Arcs, which is looking at the ways in which narrative theory and sort of story from the humanities perspective might be really useful in different sorts of contexts. And the context that we're interested in is the ways in which researchers tell stories about the research that they've done. So what kind of a story gets published in a journal article is quite restrictive in its form. It needs essentially to be ideally a nice clean narrative that tells a very clean story about how you started, the work you did, what you found, and the significance of that. And of course, research is often much, much messier than that. And it's not necessarily rewarding from a career perspective to show some of that messiness. So one of the things we want to do with the story associate, who will be starting with us in the next few weeks, and be with us for about a year, is to explore whether or not there are other kinds of ways of telling the story of a piece of research that would be just as compelling, but would be perhaps more honest and more truthful, and have a better correspondence with the way that research is normally done. And that will, I think, have many benefits, one of which is to give confidence to early career researchers that, you know, that the sorts of experiences that they're having are not unusual, and that they shouldn't be overly sort of concerned if they don't get the right answer. So those are sort of some cross-disciplinary perspectives we're having. And I want to finish up with, and this is where I'd like to ask you to have a conversation and essentially to help me, ideally. We're talking a little bit about research culture. And there's a lot of talk about research culture at the moment. I've got a definition at the top here: the behaviours, values, expectations, attitudes and norms of our research communities. And that comes from the Royal Society. Many of you will, I'm sure, be familiar with that. It gets used quite a lot when we're thinking about what research culture is. And of course, as soon as we're starting talking about behaviours, values and expectations, that's very squarely in the realm of psychology. And so this is sort of, these are sorts of things that you're far more familiar with than I am. But some of the things that UKRN has been doing is looking at some of the work that's been going on across the sector. So certainly in England, Research England has given institutions money to try and enhance research culture. And one of the things we did last year was to bring the universities together to talk about some of the projects that they've been doing to make research culture better, more positive, more inclusive, more diverse, more conducive to better research. And we produced a report on that. We also were concerned that there wasn't necessarily any opportunities for universities to collaborate on this. So each university might have its own project on supporting neurodiverse staff, for example, but they would not necessarily know that the university down the road or the university in Scotland or Wales was doing something very, very similar. So we tried to put together a catalogue of those sorts of projects. And it was interesting to see the sort of range of topics that those projects are covering. This was a snapshot in earlier this year. And you can see lots on career development, lots on EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, some on leadership, not very much, some on research ethics, not very much, some on work-life balance, not very much. So you can sort of see the kinds of topics that are being covered, and perhaps where there are gaps in the work that universities are doing to support research culture. So that was sort of interesting and built on in the work that we've subsequently done, funded by the UKRI on mapping of the landscape of interventions to support research culture. They're interested in developing what they've called a good practice exchange to help universities sort of share these sorts of this sort of work and learn from each other. Not quite sure what shape that's going to take. One of the things that led a group of universities in UKRN to wonder was a lot of these projects, well, some of these projects are evaluated, most frankly are not, or if they are evaluated, they're not evaluated terribly well. But there is a set of evidence, conceivably, that universities could be using as they think about how best to develop strategies or interventions or projects to improve research culture. So the question is, how do institutions use research evidence when they're looking at ways to improve research culture? Do we as a university, whose main jobs is to produce research evidence, actually use research evidence when we are making decisions and developing strategies about research culture? And there could well be very good reasons why we don't. You know, there's lots of reasons why one develops an intervention or a strategy, and research evidence may be only one of the things driving that. So the question is, are there supply issues about the range, the extent, the quality of the evidence that's available to institutions? Or are there sort of demand questions about the ways in which evidence is or is not used, who gets to say what counts as evidence in a university, and what status do those people need to have? So the question I'd like to ask you is this: how would you design a project that was going to answer those sorts of questions? And the reason I want to ask you that is because you're experts at designing research projects, and because we've got a research project starting in a month that's going to try and answer that question. And so I want to try and take advantage of your brains, if that's okay. So have I been clear about what the research question is for this project? Looking around and seeing blank faces.
It's helpful if it can be displayed on the screen that you can refer back to it.
Yeah, so it's the thing in red,
On the,
but you can't see it. It's actually white.
and actually, it would be useful to see the graph.
Oh,
Can you
graph as
minimize
well.
if you just press the on the left? Yeah.
Okay.
So how would you like us to do this? Like break out into groups?
Yeah,
for
so
how many minutes?
where are we now? 25. So maybe 15 or 20 minutes, if that's okay. Maybe the people in the room could split into 2 or 3 groups, and the people online could have a chat. If you could organise that.
Yeah.
Great.
And this can be a qualitative or a quantitative study.
Absolutely, and mixed methods would be great. Okay. Yeah.
Hands up who can speak to qualitative methods in the room. Okay, so maybe you split yourselves into 2 groups, and then others coalesce around those 2 people. We've got at least one qualitative person in each group. Does that make sense?
I would say also Pen and I being stream.
Yeah, that's a good
People have
point.
a
So
bit
Jackie doubles up as qualitative and.
We should definitely be in separate.
Yeah, separate groups.
One group starting at the back, just 3 people, and then those of you in the middle need to split 3 of you forwards, 2 of you backwards. Would suggest.
Yeah, just watch it.
Yeah, that's great.
That's really nice.
I think 2 groups is enough.
Marcus, can you be in a group?
Yeah.
Can you be in a group?
It's probably better if I'm not, to be honest.
Better for you.
Yes,
Better for this
but
thing. Your email.
but also I think, yeah, it'd be more interesting if you guys are not.
Okay. Well, oh wait, this, okay. Okay, I think, is this the, that seems to be, is this a? Okay. And Alex can join.
And you too.
Hi, I'm Jackie.
We met last week, I'm Mary Kay.
No, I do have it.
Basically, the names last week just went, Mary Kate.
So just to start off with that.
Hope you know that.
Yeah. And I'm in the med stream.
Got their research.
Sweet.
Okay.
And are
Exactly
you
this, but
just to
not a million miles away.
are you wanting to make the bars equal in terms of the?
I guess we have the overall question of find out how institutions use or don't use
Right, so
evidence
it's not
in
even
developing related to research culture. It's probably helpful
Projects involved.
to know that I think most institutions
yeah, there could be
talking about
that for whatever they.
as higher education
But I think they will.
generally.
Just gonna move over here and be embedded.
Most do have like in their central kind of admin
Those kind of, but it'll be
Yeah.
good.
leadership, something about somebody or some teams whose jobs are to be developing strategy. Some have particular research culture posts or themes. Don't.
So we split it up into like a standard.
Let's get to enthusiastic rabbit institutions. They are drawing down.
Okay.
Fiona's keen to learn more time.
Or like
methodology.
very small and very
Yeah, could you ping me those names?
Yeah, absolutely.
not very highly developed in this regard, and then others that have a whole, well, for instance, at Bristol, Marcus is the
That's slightly different to
for
that. UKRN.
research culture title,
Yeah.
or something like that. And He has
So the aim is to work
It'd be
out
nice
in groups
how
and-
institutions currently
You know,
use it.
He's
How
got,
institutions currently
um,
promote it.
Not really.
well,
Enough Marcus.
well, anyway, this, well, you do now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also the.
She looks really
connection.
Then we have some.
So that maybe, I'll leave that.
And that's one of those.
Yeah, but that's maybe some background knowledge that is useful.
I think to start with, just defining what we mean by
Consensus.
research culture would be helpful.
If they have it.
So I still feel like research culture is a wishy-washy term. It's not,
Right.
like, I don't know.
Agreeing with Greg.
Research
That's
culture
really
is
good.
just the culture that we have around the university as people doing research. Is
Is
it just specifically to do with open research and reproducibility, like what
Yeah.
is? So to do this study, I would need to define first.
You know, Cara, you have to start writing some things down.
One thing that stuck out without this graph is that
They're even using.
topics addressed identified in the UKRN research culture catalogue, and one of them is research culture. So initially I was like, oh, okay, maybe the definition of research culture is all of these things. Then I'm like, well, then what's research culture within there?
You get those three.
That's in the vast majority.
Is it like,
Yeah, I'll read
So I think that, yeah, because those are the, the intervention studies. That they found in some sort of, I think, scoping review.
because I suppose it's also like, which institutions do you?
Yeah, so let's assume that we can come up with a definition of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that
Wherever it comes from.
Stephen an email and
elements of research culture, like, which are important for you, but others
Yeah.
might not be.
And it would destroy.
It's like a really flexible term, way that
Yeah.
there are elements
Don't
that
really-
might apply more to you as to another person.
Don't put the.
I would start talking with the leaders who are making the decisions.
So
it's the shape
I know. Yeah.
Alex.
Might be challenging to get them.
Yeah, I think one-to-one
Is it like
meetings.
thought
are
by
focus group.
and like interviews.
Like a focus group. Yeah, we do that.
Hello. Now we find out if they can hear us in the room.
That's so much better.
We know. Okay, sorry, I slacked Marcus, but I don't know if that was what triggered that.
What triggered it?
Yeah.
Well, it's triggered. It's done.
Good. So yeah, I always struggle with the definition of research culture as well. I don't know if anyone can speak to that.
Well, I guess that's a good point. I guess the first step would be defining what research culture is.
I think Robbie would be a good person, but he has or you will. Do you have a good definition?
I do not have a good definition of research culture. I think definitely defining terms, because then we could look at whether or not the strategies and decisions are about those terms, because there may be strategies and decisions which are not happening under that definition, under the title research culture, that are research culture.
Yeah. Hi, Robbie. Sorry, I thought you might want to join.
Hello.
We were just
Right.
talking about how we define research culture, but I don't. Yeah, we weren't sure how. That's as far as we got.
Yeah, it's fair. It's
Didn't know if you might have any further insight, or I'll just Google it, I guess.
Yeah, I've just Googled it. Google says, the top result on Google says, research culture encompasses the behaviors, values, expectations, attitudes, and the norms of research communities.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
You also Google it.
It was on the tip of your tongue, Joe.
Yes, exactly.
yeah,
I
it
mean-
seems just wrapped up more in like specific practices. So people talk about research culture typically in the context of like where there seem to be bad cultures more often than not in my experience.
Yeah. And I guess on this figure, these things down the side are key, right?
Yeah.
So,
But it's like some of those things are going to be easier to measure and see what strategies and decisions have been made than others. Like, it's easy to see what values are espoused and then compare it to what people who are within a particular research culture think of those values or think whether that's being met. Because every institution will have a page somewhere which says these are the values of our research, and then the research, and I imagine those values will be fairly similar across a lot of institutions because excellence is bound to be in there in its vague form. But then you can check what, through surveys, what people actually think about whether those values are being.
I might be really basic, but if you just tried to like interview people high up in institutions and say to them, ask them the question like, do you use research evidence when making decisions related to research culture? Their answer in many ways could serve to operationalize their understanding of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a very, very broad question, isn't it? And it's really difficult to think of a study design.
You'd need a before and after, wouldn't you?
Yeah, potentially. But I suppose that depends if you're planning to change anything. Because that research question to me, just see, hang on, I've minimized it.
You got it, Joe.
Yeah, it's the red text, isn't it?
Yeah.
So in my mind, the only way to possibly do that would either be through survey, which appears that's already been done, or similar to what you may have done in your PhD, Robbie, in terms of the quality work that you've been doing.
Yeah, my stuff's not related to research culture, but yeah, I definitely will. I just ask people.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty is because it is so broad. Yeah, the ways of kind of accessing it while it is that broad is very vague, like pretty much self-reporting, surveying, and interviews. Which I'm not saying that that's always vague, but there would be ways, like if you break research culture down, if you go research culture is these things, we're looking at one aspect of it, which is behavior, maybe. That may be more measurable in some aspects of it. Like registered reports, for example, as a behavior that you can see numbers and you can look at, this is before the strategy, this is after the strategy. Has that number increased?
Yeah, I guess it's not like the similar to the things they were asking. Like, I don't know who came last week to the lab meeting, but similar stuff to what they were kind of doing in their surveys. So like asking people about their thoughts, but also the behaviors they had related to, that was more kind of just open, was it open research? I can't remember now. But yeah, that's more measurable, isn't it? Yeah, I don't know. I was thinking like, because I feel like you're trying to see if people use new research evidence to develop and change their values, because the values that universities have could be not that dissimilar to what they had like 10 years ago in theory. No, they're probably not, but how do you know if the current values are influenced by like recent research evidence? That's quite tricky, unless you've got a change, but I don't know how you capture that.
I mean, interviewing is not a bad way of capturing it.
Yeah, I think that's probably the only thing you can really.
Yeah, that makes sense right now.
The only trouble I can see with interviewing is if you were to just ask the really broad question of like, do you do this? Like, do you use evidence when making decisions related to research culture? You run the risk that people, the thing they mention in the interview is maybe like the first thing on their mind or the first thing that they remember at that time. But actually, if you gave them the really broad remit of research culture, as explained in this graph on the left there, there's like probably quite a few things that they hadn't thought about. They're like, oh, I mean, yeah, now I think about it, EDI is part of research culture, but you'd want to maybe give people, maybe this is where surveys work better, is that you can say to people like, these are all of the ways in which you could, like, all of the various facets of research culture. Do you have any initiatives related to these? And if so, how did you determine whether or not to set these up? Was it based on evidence?
Yeah.
You'd probably get people just bullshitting then. So, oh yeah, it's all evidence.
I'm wondering if we don't even ask about the evidence. There's like a leading question always, isn't it? Then, like you're saying, you could just ask them how they develop the strategies, and then if they mention something related to research evidence, whether they would, I don't know.
Yeah. I just feel like it all feels very subjective, and I wonder if you could almost ask them to like produce reports, materials that maybe they put together from evidence and like, you know, created their strategies and then do some kind of analysis on that material. But I don't even know if that's something they do. So.
I think that's a good idea. I worry about the bias within this as well, because I think a lot of the people that are going to agree to take part in this kind of stuff probably do have a high level of research culture understanding, and then probably engage in practices to support that. And but I think it would probably be next to impossible to target people that aren't that engaged with it, who are the ones that you will actually probably want for this kind of research.
Yeah,
I don't think I could suggest any ways in which you could actually recruit those kind of participants.
Well, yeah, because they do have to be within the field of developing strategies and making decisions about research culture in the first place to be kind of eligible at all. And if they are developing strategies and making decisions related to research culture without knowing anything about research culture, how do we find them?
Yeah. Probably shouldn't be doing that job.
But I guess that comes down to that definition of research culture, and we're using research culture, which is a very broad term. But there's loads of practices, like if you're in the field of career development and EDI and stuff, things that will affect research culture.
Should we come back together?
You're gonna have to be taking on the notes.
Yeah, thank you. I'll sit next to you in case I bring things.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. I hope you didn't mind me asking you to do my work for me. I hope it was an interesting thing to do. So we had 2 groups in the room and 1 group online. So let's start with the groups in the room. Just 2 or 3 minutes, somebody describe your project. What did you design?
So can online people hear us from here?
Lisa, can you tell us whether that's true or not?
Will is nodding. That looks
okay.
Well set up room if you can. Should we go first? Briefly, the first thing that we discussed was that we would need to define what research culture is quite specifically, because it can be very subjective depending on the person talking about it. But we talked about 3 different types of approach. The first being, not necessarily it would happen first, we also discussed that, but the first being a qualitative investigation with one-to-one interviews, or 1 interviewer with 1 institution. So it could be a focus group within that institution, but we didn't think that it would be appropriate to have focus groups of multi-institutions at the same time. We would ask them what they preferred as well. And in terms of sampling, We did consider random, but knowledge-based might be more appropriate in terms of knowing, given your expertise in the area, which groups may be more or less likely to have good or not good documentation based on evidence. And we wanted the sample to be representative of geography, institution type, and whether they're members or not members of UKRN. We also talked about the sample size being roughly 10 to 20 institutions and doing a thematic analysis. And the questions within that interview would kind of like quite broad and then narrow down. Broad being questions like, do you even have any documentation on research culture? And narrowing down to very specific things about what kind of evidence has gone into that. We also talked about a survey using those outcomes to reach out to more different institutions beyond the couple, given that Jackie found there were 285 just HEIs, so quite a few to go through.
Yeah.
And we also talked about doing some kind of, I didn't really know what to call it, but I called it a scoping review, where in the way that you would do a meta-analysis and you would have a pre-planned data extraction list, you would have a similar thing, but for documentation on research culture. Firstly, and that list would be, is there any documentation? Then going to, is that documentation publicly available? Then going to, is any evidence cited? And splitting down into kind of what topics you would want. So that's kind of what we discussed. Is there anything that I've missed there?
Oh, just potentially to do the scoping review and the qualitative interviews like in parallel, and then both inform the survey, questions in the survey.
Oh, and the it might be useful as part of that to have kind of a running list of definitions and be aware that different terms that people use at different institutions, there might be some jingle jangle effects where you use the same word for something or different words for the same thing.
Yeah, I love that idea. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. That's that sorted. Group at the back.
I'll attempt to cover what we spoke about, but it was a lot less structured and together than your idea. So we spoke kind of about the same scoping thing, I think, because we were talking about identifying like previous decisions that universities made in relation to research culture, and then kind of tracing that back to like how that had come to be via whom. And then we just spoke about the same as you were saying, like research culture being such a broad thing, like what does that mean, and kind of having to take an approach of just speaking to people first of all in quite an unstructured way and just like asking them kind of very broad questions. We really didn't get further than that, but just, and then kind of drawing out themes and narrowing it quite slowly into like something a bit more quant, like what questions do we want to ask about this, what does this mean to different people. Did that summarize our conversation well enough, do you reckon?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Is there anything else?
No, that sounds good. And yeah, I really like that idea of sort of almost like critical incident analysis, looking at a particular decisional strategy and then working back on how did that come to be the way it is and who was involved and who wasn't, that sort of thing. Yeah, thank you. The online group, there's have you got a spokesperson?
I think I may have volunteered. So again, ours wasn't as structured or detailed as the first group, but we had a few different ideas come up, and I think one of them.
So is your camera on?
Just a little bar on the left below.
Where it says by research culture, the title.
TARG admin.
Oh, yeah, I could do that, couldn't I?
Yeah. Ah, great. We can see you now. Sorry.
Did you hear me before?
Yes, you can hear you, Zoe.
That's fine. Yeah, so we had one of our ideas was similar to the one Millie just mentioned. So I won't talk about that too much, but we also talked about looking at the university values as they are, and maybe doing surveys to see if those values are being followed and how that maybe was informed. But we thought it was quite difficult to do with surveys because you're maybe not asking the right people. So the thing we talked most about was conducting interviews, and this was, I think, came from Robbie mostly, but other people as well. But with people who are maybe sort of higher up in university, the people that are involved in developing these strategies and making these decisions, because otherwise it might be quite hard to speak to what evidence informed that. So just kind of asking them questions about, maybe not asking them whether they had used evidence to inform these decisions, that we thought that might be quite leading, but asking them about the sorts of things they do around research culture and the strategies that they have, and then asking them what led to that. I feel like we talked a bit more about that, but I didn't write anything else down. Was there anything I've missed on that? Okay, they're shaking their heads, so that's good. And then we did comment on how the question is probably quite broad, and there's lots of different areas within research culture, so potentially focusing on particular areas within that. Jen had a good idea about maybe asking, I don't know that this is like realistic, but asking them to kind of source materials that they use to inform their developing these strategies, and then kind of doing some analysis with that. And then I think those were most of the ideas we had. Have I missed anything? No. Yeah, sorry, that's not super detailed, but just some kind of broader ideas.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. All three groups, much appreciated. Thank you very much. So that piece of work will start in November. And there is somebody in the room who'll be working on that. I can. So I think we've helped Pen and others a great deal about that. So really appreciate your help on that. Thank you very much. I hope you've got something out of the session as well. But I certainly have, and I've taken some good notes. So thank you very much. That's all I had to cover.